Right before we jump into this video, if you'd like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low light situations, just look for this orange box over on my website, put your name, email address in it, hit send it, and I will send you that guide for free. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a comparison video to help you decide which full-frame RF mirrorless camera for Canon might be the right one for you. We've got 3 cameras here. There's kind of 5 in their full-frame lineup right now, but the other 2 that are off the board, yeah, the R and the RP are not really cameras that I'm recommending right now, especially when you have these 3 bad boys right here. Starting on this side, we've got the R3, then we've got the R5, and we've got the R6. This is Canon's full-frame current lineup as we speak right now at the time of recording this. I've had extensive real-world use of all of these cameras, so I know them in and out in multiple situations, and I'm here to help you decide which one might be the right one for you, because there's differences between all of them, and that's what I'm here to help you figure out. First things first, let's start with the body design. The only camera up here that has a built-in grip is the R3. This is not considered Canon's flagship camera, but in the meantime, until they have an actual flagship camera, I consider a camera with a built-in grip kind of, like a flagship camera. Built-in means that you cannot take the grip off like you can do in the R5 and the R6. So it's one integrated body. It's in there. This is actually a lighter camera with the battery in it than the R5 without batteries and the grip attached. That is pretty insane what they've been able to do with the R3. This is more considered a higher-end pro camera that's meant for those sports shooters, that's meant for those photojournalists, even wedding photographers. I mean, you can use it for anything. That's the whole thing about cameras, is they're designed to basically do anything. Of course, there's pros and cons to all of them, and we're going to get to that as we move on. The body feel of the R5 is very nice. The button placements are in a great place. The weight of it, like I said, it's a little heavier. This is one of the lightest professional cameras that I've ever used, but that doesn't mean that this is overly heavy and not really something that you can hold on to. It's a great feeling body. The fact that you can add a grip to it, it's another $349 to do that, but I highly recommend that if you're going to be anything other than a landscape photographer, that you get a grip, because you get 2 batteries in there and you get the vertical shutter release. The same thing happens in the R6. You can use the same exact grip that you have on the R5 on the R6, or vice versa. It's the same grip. It's nice to see that you can take them off one camera and pop it onto the other. This body is a little lighter. Sorry, I just moved it just a little bit. It feels very nice in the hands. There's some different button placements, like you have a top screen on both the R5 and the R3, but you don't have a top screen on the R6. You actually have just this turn dial with your PSA&M and other user settings. Is that a deal breaker? Absolutely not, because I barely ever use the top screen because my eye is up to the viewfinder most of the time that I'm shooting. But the body designs feel really good in the hands. They're light, they feel like they're built pretty well, and I think Canon did a fantastic job across the board here. There's a couple of other differences. You've got some custom function keys on the front of the R3 that you don't have on these 2 cameras, and you've got the, what's that thing called, Steven?
Smart controller.
Smart controller. I always forget that it's called a smart controller. The smart controller is freaking awesome. These others, you have joysticks. The joystick, you can move focusing points quickly, but with the smart controller, you just slide your finger over that darn thing and they move super duper quick, and it's really accurate. So I'm gonna give an R3 a check mark, because I love, what's that thing called again? Smart controller. Check mark for the smart controller. So if you're wondering what is a check mark, it means absolutely nothing. I just like giving them out from time to time on which camera I think is winning, and so maybe you can keep track of it, but if one has more check marks than the other at the end, it doesn't really mean very much. I'm just letting you in on a secret. Now let's talk about the sensors inside of these cameras. The R3 has a 24.1 megapixel full-frame stacked BSI CMOS sensor that is powered by a Digic X processor. The R5 has a 45 megapixel full-frame sensor powered by the Digic X processor, and the R6 has a 20.1 megapixel full-frame sensor that's also powered by a Digic X processor. So what's the difference between a stacked sensor and just a regular sensor? Well, you get a faster readout with the R3's sensor because it is a stacked sensor. Now, where does that come in play? Well, if you're photographing a baseball player and you're using, say, the electronic shutter in these cameras, and the batter is taking a swing, do you see how the ball and bat are warping? That's right, because there's a slower readout speed from the time you press that shutter. What happens is the sensor is reading the data like this, or whichever way it's reading it. But it's reading it, and then it takes the picture, and it's sometimes a little slower and a little bit behind. When you have a stacked sensor, it's a faster readout. So you don't get that bowing, and I haven't seen any of that bowing in the R3 at all. So those are the differences between a stacked sensor and a regular sensor, but there's megapixel differences. 24 megapixels is in this camera because this one is more designed for those action photographers, sports shooters that shoot really fast, want to move the data through the camera, and then they don't need the most massive file in the world. The 45 megapixel sensor inside of the R5 is amazing. This is an extremely well-rounded camera that's great for weddings, it's great for sports, it's great for portraits, it's great for landscapes. It's a really well-rounded camera. And the R6 with its 20.1 megapixel sensor is kind of on the lower side, but I remember the days where I was shooting with 4.1 megapixels back in 2003 and 2004. 20 is still a good place, but Nikon and Sony in the same range of camera has slightly higher megapixels. That is really not a deal breaker. It just means that you're not going to be able to crop as far if you're a cropper, and I personally don't crop my images, so I'm totally fine with that. So do any of the cameras get a check mark here? Yeah, okay, I'll give the R5 a check mark because it's super well-rounded, and 45 megapixels is great. Will you get some of that bowing with super fast action if you're only using the electronic shutter? The answer is yes. And when you're using the mechanical shutter, you don't have that issue, so they're gonna be very similar across the board there. Just remember, that's with the electronic shutter where you might see some of that bowing happening. Continuing on with the specs, let's go with ISO. The R3 goes natively 100 to 102,400, expandable up to 204,800. Then the R5 goes from 100 natively up to 51,200, expandable up to 102,400. And the R6 goes from 100 to 102,400, expandable up to 204,800, which is very similar, if not exactly the same, as what you get in the R3. Now, why can't you expand the ISO as far natively with the R5? That's because it has more megapixels, and generally speaking, when you squeeze more pixels on there, they're not able to grab as much light as you would with something like this. You've got larger pixels, which tends to give you better low light shooting capability. But the truth of the matter is, today, in 2021, when we're filming this, or 2022, whenever you're watching this, or honestly, anytime down the road when you're watching this, we're shooting at places. I've shot this camera at 16,000 ISO and not had an issue. Yes, you're gonna see some grain and some noise in the image, but that's like a film structure. It's perfectly fine. Whereas back in the day, I couldn't push past 1,000 ISO. So the fact that you can shoot comfortably at 8,000 ISO if you needed to is awesome. So yeah, it doesn't go as far natively with the R5, but it's gonna be great any way you slice it. We've pushed the R6 really far. This performs well. The R3 performs well. If I had to give a check mark and say which one would perform the best with higher ISO, I'm gonna go with the R3 with a slight edge over its little brother here, the R6. Moving on to frame rate, which is actually a differentiator between these cameras. The R3 will give you 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. You can actually dumb it down slightly, but it will only give you the option to choose between 3, 15, and 30 when you're shooting with the electronic shutter. Now, let me explain to you this real fast. This camera is really meant to be shot with the electronic shutter, which is silent. That's why you have a stacked sensor in this camera. It allows you to get that faster readout, and that's why they kind of get rid of the shutter, and why Nikon with the Z9 got rid of the shutter altogether. Now, I don't mind still having the shutter because I've been in situations where shooting a concert, there's some flickering light that I couldn't dial the shutter speed in perfectly the way that I wanted it, and I picked up some banding or flickering from the light, and I had to switch back into the mechanical shutter. Generally speaking, you're not going to use the mechanical shutter in this camera unless you absolutely need it, because the electronic shutter is fantastic, giving you 30 frames per second, which is really something that's unheard of just a couple years ago. So the fact that you can do that is absolutely incredible. Now let's move on to the R5. You can do 12 frames per second mechanical and 20 frames per second electronic. Something I do need to mention for those of you who might be wondering, at 12 frames per second with the mechanical, you get 13-bit RAW files. In order to get 14-bit, you got to dumb it down to shoot at 8 frames per second. Will you see a difference between those two? The answer is no. You're never going to see the difference between those two things. But 12 frames per second is with the mechanical, and you can get 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, and that's going to give you a 12-bit file with the electronic shutter. But geez, man, 12 and 20? What an awesome option, and I haven't run into issues shooting with the electronic shutter at 20 frames per second. Generally speaking, you use the electronic shutter. It used to be for when you want to shoot silent. I mean, I just find myself shooting silent all the time with the R3 at this point. And if I don't need to shoot silent because there's a lot of noise, but I want to shoot at a faster frame rate, then I have no problem shooting with the electronic shutter. Just remember, like I said, if you're shooting fast moving subjects that are moving back and forth like this, you might see some issues at some point. And if you don't need more than 12 frames a second, then stick with those 12 frames a second. But when you need to shoot silent, you switch over to the electronic shutter and you do that. The R6 gives you 12 frames per second mechanical and 20 frames per second electronic shutter, the same 12-bit when you shoot the 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. How about them apples? Two different cameras here that both do 12 frames mechanical and 20 frames per second silent. Canon, again, did a fantastic job incorporating a lot of speed in all of the cameras across the board, no matter what the prices are. So who gets a check mark? Who? I mean, the R3 is still going to get a check mark. Why? Because it's 30 frames a second. Let me jump in here real quick to show you FroPak 3 in action on this file from the Canon R3, starting with Fifth Element. Fifth Element gives it a pretty unique look right off the bat. Next, we've got Almost Famous with no grain. It kind of gives it a pretty filmic look, which is actually pretty cool. Then we've got Eckert, which is a really good catch-all one, and Prestige Worldwide looks really good on this as well. Look at that. But I do want to go back to FroPak 1 to show you two of these. We've got Waffle House. That I love the way that one looks. And then, of course, one of my go-tos is Skittles to make it go boom. Now, if you're looking to give yourself a great starting point as well as speed up your RAW workflow, we created 15 all-new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPak3. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters. If you decide to pick them up right now, they are still on sale. Or if you want to get FroPak 1, FroPak 2, and FroPak 3 together as an ultimate bundle, you can do that and save even more. Now, let's get back to the video. Now let's talk about the lens mounts. Earlier I said that these are RF cameras. What that means is it's the RF mount, this, and this. The older Canon cameras had what's called an EF mount, and this replaces the EF with the RF. It's a nice mount. It's designed for the newer cameras for mirrorless systems just like this. But that doesn't mean you can't use your EF glass adapted to these cameras. You can get the EF to RF adapter for all of these cameras that allows you to take your older EF lenses, whether they're Tamron, whether they're Sigma, or whether they're Canon, and pop them onto this bad boy and use them pretty seamlessly. The autofocus is still fantastic when you adapt it. I've adapted a 400 2.8 to this bad boy, and it works great, and that's a 10-year-old plus lens. I've also used the Sigma 70 to 200 2.8 EF lens on this with the RF adapter. It's fantastic. There's so many older lenses to choose from, but also the RF lens lineup that Canon has come up with is absolutely fantastic. You have a lot of professional choices, higher end, like a 28 to 70 f2. You've got the 85 1.2, 50 1.2. You have a 15 to 35 2.8, as well as a 15 to 35 f4. There's a lot of options. You got the entire Hebrew Trinity, so you have a lot of good professional glass, and they're starting to come out with more affordable options for something like an 800mm f11 or a 600mm f11. There's a lens for you on this system, so the RF mount gets a check mark. You know what? I'm giving a check mark to Canon. Just Canon. Good job. One of the biggest things to talk about is autofocus with these cameras and how many focusing points they have. Across the board, you've got 1,053 phase detect autofocusing points on each of these cameras that covers 100% of the viewfinder. That means if you can see it, you can move a focusing point to it. Now, there are some slight differences. The R3 can do 60 calculations a second, which gives you a faster autofocusing, so they say, and I honestly haven't seen a difference between the R6, the R5, and the R3. Their autofocusing systems are fantastic. The fact that you have the same autofocusing system in the less expensive R6 that you have in the R5 and very similar in the R3, just slightly improved, is insane. The lock-on tracking, the IAF, the eye detect, the animal eye detect, everything about these focusing systems is amazing. Whether you go with an R6 or you go with an R3, you are not going to be disappointed by the quality and capability of the autofocus in these cameras. So I'm not even gonna give a check mark to any of these cameras because they're all amazing when it comes to autofocus. Top notch. That's honestly a reason that the RP and R are not sitting here, because they're fine. They do an okay job, but they don't match what these cameras can do. Moving on to burst rates, the R3 will give you 1,000 raw files when shooting the mechanical shutter at 12 frames a second, or 150 when shooting with the electronic shutter at 30 frames per second. That means you're at like 5 seconds of smashing that shutter button down. You really shouldn't have to go over that. I mean, if you hold down a shutter button for 5 seconds, I kind of want to walk over to you and just be like, why are you doing that? The action happens, take the burst, but don't sit there and like make a movie. We're not making movies. We're not making movies. So don't try not to make movies. With the R5, you get 180 raw files when shooting mechanical at 12 frames per second and 83 when shooting with the electronic shutter at 20 frames per second. It's a lot of files, guys. You're not gonna outrun these systems unless you smash that button and you just leave your finger pressed on it at all times. Now, speaking of smashing things, Mr. Peter McKinnon, hey, can you guys hit the thumbs up button while you're at it? Like there. Not that dislike, not that we see that anymore, but just the thumbs up, you know, just go ahead and hit that thumbs up. Now the R6 will give you 240 raw files in a row when you're shooting with the mechanical or the electronic. A part of that is that you're using a 20 megapixel sensor. There's less data that it needs to move, but you can get a ton of shots in a row with all of these cameras. And again, I'm not giving a check mark because they all pass the test. Now moving into video. Yes, if you didn't know, you can shoot video with all of these cameras because video is a huge part of being a creator these days. You can't just be a photographer anymore. I mean, you can, but a lot of times people are like, do you shoot video as well? And your answer should be, Steven? Yes. It should always be yes, even if it's a no, because then you figure it out and then you can make more money. But let's start with the R3. Full frame 6K DCI 12-bit RAW video recording up to 60 frames per second, or 4K up to 120 frames per second at 10-bit 422 in H.265. 4K oversampled from 6K with no pixel binning in all modes except 4K 120. You can do C-Log. There is not a full HDMI port on the side of this camera. People who already know about video know that a lot of the higher end video cameras or cameras like this have a full HDMI port so that you can go out to something like an Atomos recorder. But in this day and age, they've started to allow you to do the recording internally, so you don't really have to do it externally, so they didn't put it in there. Is that a deal breaker for people? The answer is no, but you have a what's that, micro, Steven? Yep. Micro. Not even a mini. It's micro. It's really dinky and dainty, but it's not that big of a deal. You can record all of this right inside of the camera. Now, you also have no overheating with this camera and unlimited record time. You also will get some really nice and clean higher ISO video because of the size of the sensor in this compared to the R5. But again, overheating has become a thing since the R5 had some overheating issues when it first came out. I'll talk about that in just a minute, but you get some nice video features with this R3. It is a well-rounded, top-of-the-line camera right there. Now let's jump into the R5. You have full-frame 8K DCI 12-bit RAW video recording up to 30 frames per second. Or you can do 4K up to 120 frames per second at 10-bit 422 in H.265. 4K is oversampled all the way from that 8.1K with no pixel binning, only up to 30 frames per second. There's C-Log, you still have that micro HDMI port. There are some overheating issues. Now, what does that mean? When this camera first came out, if you shot 8K video, you got like 18 minutes of record time before the camera said, hey, you're a little hot, you know, because you're in my hand, so of course you're gonna be hot. You're a little hot, you might need to take a cooling off time. Now that's not great, but again, you were shooting 8K for 18 minutes. That's a lot of data. In 4K, we were doing something like 30-ish minutes. They put out some firmware, which now allows us to get, what, about 45 to 60 minutes, Stephen?
Yeah.
Yeah, about 45 to 60 minutes, depending on the heat and the situation you're in. If it's cooler, your camera's gonna stay cooler, but honestly, Canon probably doesn't want us saying this. We bought some $24 fans on Amazon for strollers that we just put on tripods and we just let it on low, setting 1, just let it blow on the back of the camera the whole time we're recording, and we basically can go infinitely when we do that. Now that's not the unlimited record time, because the R3 gives you unlimited record time. You get 29.59, that's your limit here, and then you have to hit record again. You have to stop it and then start it, and you can keep going. But the fan for us, in the situation, the way that we're using it, we just let it blow on the back of the camera. It is what it is at this point. It's not really a deal breaker, but if you're shooting in super hot weather and you're not using one of those fans, you might run into some overheating when it comes to shooting video. Overheating with stills has never been a thing for us at all. And now would be a good time to mention that we're shooting this video with 2 Canon R5s. We got one right there, and we got one pointing right here, and that's what we've been recording all of our videos for over a year now at the factory, because we really like the quality that we're able to pull out of the R5. That's why we use those in the studio for recording our video. The R6 in the video front is full frame 4K UHD video recording up to 60 frames per second at 10-bit 422 in H.265. 4K is oversampled from 5.1K with no pixel binning in all 4K modes. You can do 1080p at 120 frames per second, so no 4K at 120. You have C-Log as well as that micro HDMI port. In terms of overheating, we haven't seen overheating issues with the R6. I mean, it will eventually get there. It's gonna take a lot to overheat this because you're not moving as much data. You're not downsampling from 8K to 4K. It's 5.1K to 4K. You still have the 29.59 limit in this bad boy, but you should get a lot more record time. I mean, all of these cameras are fully capable of getting great video, because honestly, with video, it's a lot of what you do with it, right? How do you shoot it? Because you could use your phone and produce something amazing, or you could use the most expensive camera in the world and still get bad results if you don't know what you're doing. Check mark, though, we're gonna give it. This is kind of tough, Steven. It's kind of tough because, you know, you got the R3, which is fantastic with the unlimited record time, the no overheating, except for the fact that it's larger, it is lighter, but it's also gonna be more expensive. I think versatility-wise, the R5 is absolutely fantastic. If you're gonna be running and gunning and shooting like weddings all day, you may wanna carry that fan around with you, but the truth of the matter is, if you're not recording continuously for hours at a time, and you're starting and stopping, the new firmware that's in these cameras is going to be fine. So if you're not shooting continuously for 2 hours, no problem at all. So I'm gonna go ahead and give a check mark to the R5. It's just a fantastic, well-rounded camera when it comes to shooting video compared to the other bad boys right here. But the other ones are pretty close too. Let me jump in here real quick and let you know that this video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you're looking to build your very own online portfolio, use what I use because it's simple, easy, affordable, and you don't need to know coding. And better yet, head on over to squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto to get your 14-day free trial. And if you decide that it's for you, use the code FroKnowsPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Moving on to image stabilization. Each one of these cameras has the same exact image stabilization, which is pretty cool across the board. You get 5-axis in-body stabilization if a lens does not have IS built in. But if you have one of those RF lenses, or some of the RF lenses that has IS built in, you'll get up to 8 stops, and in some cases, 7 stops of extra, or not extra, but 7 stops of total stabilization. You can handhold these lenses and these cameras at super low shutter speeds. Now keep in mind, I say this in all of the videos where I talk about image stabilization. If you have a subject that is moving super fast across your frame and you're shooting at a super slow shutter speed, the image stabilization will not freeze your subject. It will just help you stay more balanced, and still the background's going to be nice and sharp if it's not moving, but that subject is still going to move across. It's just really good when you're shooting video to have this great stabilization handheld. The fact that you can have up to 8 stops of IS with the IS RF lenses is fantastic. So check mark across the board. Like literally, I want it to go all the way. All right, you don't have to make it go all the way across the board because I know that takes extra time to edit. Moving on to the electronic viewfinders in these cameras, we've got a 5.76 million dot blackout-free EVF with 120 frames per second refresh rate and eye control sensors in the R3. The R5 has a 5.7 million dot EVF with the same 120 frames per second refresh rate. It does not have the blackout-free shooting. It's not even something that you really notice anymore when you're shooting. And the R6 dumbs it down a little bit to 3.69 million dot EVF with 120 frames per second refresh rate. It also doesn't have blackout-free. What they mean by blackout-free is while you're shooting, you don't ever lose sight of what you're seeing through your electronic viewfinder. I don't lose sight of it anymore. I mean, I'm so used to even shooting at 3 and 5 frames a second with a DSLR or when shooting film, and you lose it for a split second. It's not a deal breaker. People have been doing it forever. Not a big deal. The electronic viewfinder, for those of you who don't know, compared to what's called an optical viewfinder, is you are seeing it's like a little TV inside, and you're getting the signal through the lens, the light through the lens, off the sensor, and into the viewfinder, and that's what you're seeing. Optical means you're literally seeing optically what you see through the lens is what you're getting because it's bouncing off of mirror boxes. We did an awesome video on that a couple years ago. Check that out down below. The nicest EVF here is the R3, but the R5 is very good and the R6 is fine. I don't notice issues. The only time you'll ever see a difference is if you look through an R6 and you look through an R5 and you look through an R3, you may notice some differences. Now, I did mention that the R3 has eye control. That's why this one sticks out a little further and is a little thicker because they had to put the eye control in there. We can't show you an example of it working in the real world because it kind of needs your eye sticking, like looking through the camera. It really is like this. It's where you look is where the focus is going to go. So if you have multiple subjects across a frame, say they're running down the track and you have lane 1 through 6, you need to get a picture of each of them. You look at lane 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, and you just get them in focus. It's pretty amazing how it works. I honestly turned it off for most of the things that I've shot just because the autofocus is so darn good at finding the faces and the eyes even with action that I don't want to mess and maybe miss something because I'm looking in the wrong place. So all the EVFs are very good, but we'll go ahead and give a check mark to the R3. I mean, it's the most expensive camera here, so it's going to have a lot more check marks, but when we get to the end, we're going to have a nice discussion. Now let's talk about max shutter speed. Back in the day, some of the lower end cameras maxed out at 1/4000th of a second. Well, the R3 will max out at 1/64,000th of a second. That is a lot. That's because it's the electronic shutter and you can capture 1/64,000th of a second. You may say, where would that come in handy? Well, you've got 1.2 lenses from Canon. So if you're shooting outside, bright daylight at 1.2 at 100 ISO, you're going to need a super fast shutter speed to be able to do that and without having to use any ND filters on the outside of your lens. That's amazing. 1/64,000th of a second. You can do 1/8000th of a second with the R5. I wish they would have sped that up to at least 1/16,000th. I mean, why not? If you can do that, maybe they could have done that for the electronic. Who knows? Then 1/8000th of a second here for the R6. But what the R3 has that the other two do not have is what's called a variable shutter speed option. Actually, it has flicker detect, where you can point this camera at some light that is flickering. You can hit a button and it will dial in the exact shutter speed to match that flicker so that you do not see that flicker anymore. That comes in handy if you're shooting LCD screens where there's just, you always see a flicker, or you're at a concert where there's lots of different lights and they're flickering. Variable shutter rate is amazing. You can see it working right in front of your eye. When I was shooting I was photographing Jane's Addiction, and I'm in the dressing room, and I see that the light is blinking. I'm like, let's go to variable shutter speed. And I'm at like 1/534.3th of a second, right, instead of 1/500th. And I was able to dial it in so that I no longer saw that banding happening. That's amazing that you have that feature. So anyway, those are the how high you can go with your shutter speeds. It's amazing that you can get a shutter speed of 1/64,000th of a second, as well as that amazing variable shutter speed option. Now let's move on to the LCD screens on these cameras. Starting with the R3, you have a 3.2-inch, 4.15 million dot vari-angle touchscreen. That means it can flip out and rotate. I'm still not a fan of the flip out and rotate screen. If you're gonna flip out and rotate, at least get flush with the back of the camera. I find it so difficult to get my line straight because you can see that it doesn't get flush when it's flipped out. You can see that it's still on a slight bend, which means it's much more difficult to get your lines and your angles straight. That to me is a problem, and one of the reasons I don't like these flip out screens, which they all have flip out screens. I don't like that it's hard to get my line straight. Also, if you're gonna shoot photos, you don't wanna hold a camera out like this using the LCD screen. If you have these cameras, you're really not doing that unless you're shooting video. But even if you are shooting video, you can look right through the electronic viewfinder. But anyway, you've got a very nice screen, nice quality, nice touchscreen on the back of the R3. The R5 is a 3.2-inch, 2.1 million dot vari-angle touchscreen. Same thing applies because the screen still is tilted just a little bit, so it makes getting your angles and lines straight a little bit harder. And then the R6 has only a 3-inch, I say only, but that's better than a 1.8-inch back in the day, a 3-inch, 1.62 million dot vari-angle touchscreen. Look, less dots means a little bit less resolution, but I don't see an issue with any of this. I really don't. The times that I use the LCD screen are to change my settings if I'm not looking through the viewfinder. And when I'm reviewing images, I like to put my eye up to the viewfinder to review the image because it just looks better. It looks like there's more resolution inside of the electronic viewfinder than on the back of the screen. So that's what I have to say about that. Who's gonna get a check mark? I mean, the R3 still gets a check mark because it's a higher resolution one, but across the board, you're not gonna see much of a difference. Let me jump in here real quick and say, would you like to purchase any of these cameras new, or would you like to pick up any camera gear for that matter? Well, go where I go to shop and check out allenscamera.com. They are a mom and pop store that's been around for over 40 years. They've supported me from the beginning, and I continue to support them. If you're looking to buy used, new, old, trade-in, whatever you want, go to allenscamera.com and don't forget to tell them that the Fro sent you. Moving on to card slots, because we need to save all those pictures to something. We've got 2 card slots in the R3, one CF Express Type B and one UHS 2 SD card slot. You can write photos and video to both of these cards, which is nice. I like to do redundancy. I personally like to see 2 of the same exact cards in the camera. There's no reason why you can't have 2 CF Express Type B cards, or you could be like Sony and put 2 CF Express Type A slots in there, because you could use Type A cards as well as SD cards in those same slots. Now, with that being said, the Type B cards are super fast. You can write data to them super quick, and you can get data off of them super quick. They're also less expensive than the A ones for CF Express. Now, the R5 has the same exact slots, same thing. I still would prefer 2 of the same, and the R6 has 2 of the same. 2 UHS 2 SD card slots. You can write photos and videos to both. Same with the R5. You can write photo and video to both. You know, Steven, I'm going to give a check mark to the R6 because it has 2 of the same. So take that, you two. Is it better? I rather not have SD cards these days. I rather have the faster cards of the CF Express Type B, but I really want to see dual redundant. I want to see the same cards, so I don't have to carry around SD as well as the other cards. Deal breaker? No, not at all. Just know that you're dumbing down. If you're shooting redundant photos, you have the CF Express B and an SD card, you're going to be dumbing down your write speeds and your buffer to the slower card. So keep that in mind. But check mark R6. Now let's talk about Wi-Fi. The R3 will give you 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. You get 5.0 Bluetooth as well as an Ethernet port built right in, because again, that's designed for those sports shooters and those news shooters who need to plug right in. Plus, you got the bigger body. That's why it can take advantage of that. Moving on to the R5, we've got 2.4 gigahertz as well as 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, 5.0 Bluetooth, support for wireless transfer or wired Ethernet transfer if you use the added grip that does it. Now, that's a more expensive grip. You can put that grip on there. It gives you the Ethernet and it gives you extra wireless transfer. It's more expensive. If you need it, obviously it's for you, so think about it. Moving on to the R6, you've got 2.4 gigahertz and you've got the 4.2 Bluetooth. Now, you don't have 5.0. You can't put the other grip on here and get the wireless transfer to be faster. It does not allow you to do that, so just get the regular grip for this bad boy. So who gets the check mark? We're gonna give it to the R5 and the R3 because you can kind of get the same functionality. It just may cost you a little bit of money to get that extra grip right here. Battery power is always super important. You get the LPE19 battery with USB charging for the R3. Moving on to the R5, you've got the LPE6NH battery. You can also do USB charging, and with the added grip, you can put in 2 batteries to extend your battery life by 2 probably. 2, you know, because 2 batteries. The R6, same thing. You've got the LPE6NH battery. You can do USB charging, which is when we're filming video, we actually plug in with, what's it, Anker, Steven? It's an Anker charger. I believe it's from a company called Anker. It's a USB charger. It's like 37 bucks. Instead of spending 150 or 60 bucks for the adapter for the Canon, we've just been using that plugged in right into the camera. It keeps us going all day long. You get a lot of battery life out of the bigger battery in the R3, of course. But with the 2 batteries that you would get with the grip, you're gonna get a lot of life out of these things. It's not like the old cameras, the old mirrorless cameras where you just lost battery life super quick. Always have extra batteries. If you can get the grip, I always recommend you get the grip and you get extra batteries. It's just much better, so you don't have to worry about changing them out so often. Couple more things to talk about. Let's go to weight. The R3 weighs in at 2.2 pounds or 1,015 grams. The R5 weighs in at 1.62 pounds, 738 grams without the grip. Now without the grip, the R6 comes in at 1.5 pounds or 680 grams, making it the winner because it's lighter. It gets the check mark. It's been working out. So yeah, that's why it can, anyway. But what's interesting is the fact that, and I said this earlier, the R3 with the battery is lighter than the R5 with a grip without a battery. So if weight is an issue, the R6 is going to be good for you. And if you've got more money, then it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. But let's talk about money now, because we're at price. The R3 comes in at $59.99, aka $6,000 before tax. You've got the R5 at $38.99. If you add a grip to that, you're spending an extra $349. So keep that in mind. To get that grip, you're in the $40-some $100 range plus tax. And the R6 is $24.99, same $349 if you want to add a grip. $6,000 is a lot of money for a camera. Some people may be like, it's only 24 megapixels. Why is it $6,000? Because it's a feat of engineering. This is a fantastic camera. Which one would I recommend? Which one would get the check mark? Well, that's a difficult question because it's all a matter of what's your budget and what do you shoot. You can do a lot of damage with an R6. If you shoot weddings, if you shoot sports, if you do portraiture, if you do video, this is an unbelievably well-rounded camera for $2,500. You can do everything. And like I said earlier, you can do anything with anything if you know what you're doing. Of course, there's limitations, but the R6 is priced right. The R5, yeah, it's a little more expensive, but if you make money as a wedding photographer, this is an unbelievable camera for wedding photos. You've got your 45 megapixels, you shoot at 12 frames a second, you shoot at 20 frames per second silent. It is a fantastic option. Put all the glass on it. This camera is a dream for wedding photographers. It's honestly all you ever need. If you need a backup camera, pick up an R6 as a backup camera. There's nothing wrong with it. This is just one of the best, most well-rounded cameras ever made. Great autofocus, all the other stuff I talked about. I can't say enough on how good this is. And the R3 is fantastic for what it is. Do I wish that it had a 45 megapixel stack sensor in it? Yeah. If it had that, it would be hands down the greatest camera up here on the counter, on the bowling alley actually. But with that said, Canon is still threatening to have an R1 at some point, which will probably bring us a 45, a 50, a 60, who knows how many megapixels. It's gonna be expensive, but it's gonna be fast. In this world, right, if I'm sitting here and I'm starting out or I'm trying to figure out what camera to go with, I am hard pressed to tell you not to go with an R5. Unless you are a top-of-the-line professional shooting sports, high-end. You can do weddings with this 24, but I don't think you need it. I think the R5 is the way to go for most people out there. So which one would you go with and why? Let me know down below. I thank you guys very much for watching. If you got this far, say hashtag got this far down in the comments. There you have it. Jared, Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.